Well, be gone for a few days. It seems like perhaps the best thing to do is to give you a little lecture from home. This is basically stuff we would have covered in the classroom in a slightly different way, but this should work. The idea with these things, as always, you listen. Occasionally I will ask you to slow down and think about something. I can't make you do that. The school turned down my request to have cameras put in your room so I can watch you at home. So I'm just going to have to take your word for it that you're doing that. And slow down, try to provide an answer, think about what I'm asking, and then start the video again. And of course, one of the nice things is if you miss something, you can always go back or divide it up into 2 or 3 listens, etc. So I ask you to bring in some notes that you've taken on this and some questions for discussion, and that's what you'll be doing when we all return. So you will notice, starting with this first slide, that I have put quotation marks around a couple of words. Now, quotation marks can mean an exact quote, but it can also mean casting some doubt upon what is being written. It was inevitable that the Americas be discovered by 1500. Stop the film for a second. What is wrong with inevitable and discovered? Now, inevitable, of course, means it must happen. It will happen. There is no other possibility. And in fact, it was not inevitable, quite literally. It was, however, extraordinarily likely for some of the reasons that we'll come across. And discovered, of course, is a pretty loaded term. If I were to walk in your room and see your iPhone sitting on top of your desk, I could say, I have discovered it, it is mine. My guess is that you would not be terribly satisfied with that. Needless to say, the probably 20 to 25 million Native Americans living in the Americas were pretty darn aware of where they were. They had long since discovered it, having come over from the land bridge across Alaska, perhaps 15, 20, 25,000 years earlier. Perhaps the better term would be the Americas be explored by Europeans. When I was growing up, this was the age of discovery. Eventually historians said, boy, that's pretty one-sided. It is an age of exploration, to be true, and a final linking of every place on the planet. I'm now going to show you a variety, like 6, 7, 8 images or statistics or whatever else, and ask you to stop the film and explain to me what you are seeing and how this could make it, if not quite inevitable, really, really likely that Europeans would reach the Americas by 1500. This is the first. Stop the film. What are you seeing, and how does this lead to America's discovery? And of course, it's shipping technology. These were bigger ships. They were safer at the big seas. They could hold more supplies. If you have a ship that allows you to take 3 Twinkies and a Cadbury bar, well, it's not really going to be worth the investment. But now these are storing enough stuff to make it economically feasible. Holding cannon, and I know it looks like I made a typo. I think I corrected the major one that I did make. The plural of cannon, God love the English language, is cannon, which is ludicrous, but that's the way it is. In other words, they could protect themselves. Europeans, by this point, had taken a hold of Chinese gunpowder technology, and these ships were little war factories in their own way. A hull is the lining of the boat itself. It's reinforced. In other words, rough winds bumping into something won't sink it. Hey, our friends, the lateen sails. Again, when in doubt, mention lateen sails on any FRQ question. Again, they can bend, they can collect the wind, and the ships don't need to go directly with the wind behind its back. It can go in almost any direction. Caravels, another good example of something that could be used on an FRQ question. I don't know much about them, except these were relatively lighter. They were faster. They had more storage area in them. These were simply new ships that had been developed in the probably 15th century. And very small detail, well, not small, but I don't know much about it. The rudder which steers the ship had been moved to the back, and this just made it far more efficient. In other words, these ships were ready to go across the Atlantic. Let's take a look at the next slide. Once more, stop and think, what am I looking at, and how does this make it, quote-unquote inevitable that the Americas be reached by 1500. And separate from the ships themselves are the navigation tools. The compass, the astrolabe. The compass, of course, you know from China. The astrolabe used the stars to navigate, and they became this little handheld device made it very possible to know exactly what latitude you were at. That's awfully important because eventually, by the 1460s, 1470s, people understood about how far north to South Africa was. But the only way that you could possibly know if you've reached the southern tip of Africa, well, you've got to go along the coast. And you can probably realize that there are some problems with coastal travel. The rocks are there, you may not have the best wind currents or the ocean currents, and you may also have fairly sophisticated people living along those coasts who don't really want to see you there necessarily. So actually what was able to happen is a lot of these ships, because they had such a clear idea of where they were able to go out into the deeper seas, they were able to follow the better ocean currents, all of this. The ability to measure speed, in other words, to understand how far are we going, how long should it take, how many supplies do we need to bring. Added to all of this, the knowledge of the winds, of the currents. Now, you're familiar with the monsoon winds, and those had been well established for a long time. But if you look at a map of wind currents across the globe, there are regular wind currents that blow in certain directions, certain times of the years. And you've also got ocean currents that simply go certain places, certain ways. And knowing all of this, plus the maps, the charts, etc., simply made the ability to navigate these new ships that much more effective. Moving on to a third reason for the inevitability. Actually, we're not moving on to the third reason. This, of course, is the world as was known probably about 1480 or so, and of course, it's a much bigger world than that. Number 3. Stop for a second. How does this make it inevitable? Okay, huge population increase. That's obvious. Well, what does that have to do with exploration? One thing is that in Christian Europe, there was what they call a primogeniture system. Now, genitor, genes, genetics, primo, first. Bottom line, the oldest male in a family inherited all the family's wealth. Well, what do the 4 younger sons do? Of course, the daughters would get married and get their dowry and so forth because it was not a woman's world at that point. What about the 4 younger sons? Well, that's fine. There was more land available. They would simply go off and seek their own fortune. Not with this population increase. Probably not. In fact, land became harder to find and more expensive. So, what are these young men doing? Well, they become a surplus of labor. They start moving into the cities. They need to do something. We need to do something, that larger population. So you're finding them work on these ships, to be sure. You're also finding more people, means more people who want to buy things, which means there is far more need for greater production. That greater production, of course, means more need to buy and sell, etc. Also, more people with more wealth, greater tax base, there becomes simply more wealth to spend overall, money to spend on these bigger ships. And bottom line, more people to buy stuff means more trade impetus. So there's a purely financial reason for this as well. Moving on to number 4. Take a look. What are you looking at? How does this make it inevitable that the Americas be explored by 1500? And that, of course, is Johann Gutenberg's printing press that you just saw. Now, the Chinese had developed typeset printing. Of course, Chinese is a very difficult language. You don't have 26 letters or 31 letters. You have thousands of entirely different little ideograms or pictograms. So far more difficult to do, more difficult to read, more difficult to print. With the Gutenberg press, which I want to say is about 1440, give or take a couple of years, might have been a few years earlier, what this means is that all you would need to do is print up hundreds of little A's, hundreds of little B's, hundreds of little C's, little metal letters, and then slowly arrange them on a giant grid, slather it with ink, and although that's very time-consuming, once you've done that, all you need to do is take sheets of paper and go one page printed, one page printed, good sound effects, huh? One page printed, etc., etc. Far slower than today's laser printers, of course, but keep in mind, up until this point in Western Europe, if you wanted a copy of a book, somebody, generally a monk, had to sit down and copy it by hand. A 300-page book might take somebody a year to copy, and it's going to be incredibly expensive. This means the amount of information that was out there suddenly multiplied 10, 15, 20, 100-fold almost immediately. And notice when this is happening. It's right following or during the period of the Renaissance, where although it's a small part of the population, a significant group of intellectuals, of artists, of theorists, of philosophers are asking big questions. There is a thirst for knowledge. There's simply that idea that knowledge in and of itself is valuable, that man is the measure of all things. We want to know humanity. Certainly you see the increased knowledge coming from earlier explorers. Now, Prince Henry the Navigator, who we'll look at later, was more of a funder and trainer of navigators and of explorers, but plays a major role in this. And what is being printed on the Gutenberg press? Well, you know it's largely religious tracts. It's largely copies of the Bible, but not exclusively. And it turns out, to the degree that there is a bestseller list at this time period, it's often these early travel accounts. People that went to the west coast of Africa, people that saw things that had never been seen before, Marco Polo's trips toward Asia. Well, this strikes a curiosity in people. Maybe this is something I could do too. By the way, the mere fact that people are now living in cities means that education is more common. Do most people living in cities read and write well at 1500? Of course not. But a larger percentage of the population does, and the information, the curiosity, begins to spread. We'll take a look now at a fifth reason why it was inevitable. This one might be a little bit harder for you to grasp, but let me ask you this way. Are you familiar with any of the individuals responsible for any of this work? Now, of course, Henry the Navigator is an individual. Michelangelo's David, Da Vinci, etc. What I'm sort of getting at here is that something had really changed, and it was a result of it's the rise of individualism. Often people say the individual was invented during the Renaissance. Let me give you an example. Go home tonight to your favorite bathroom, look at the toilet, and see where the man who installed the toilet, where he signed his name. My guess is that he didn't. He is simply a craftsperson doing his job. You don't sign the toilet that you installed. You know, up until the Renaissance, that was the case with artwork. Medieval art, almost exclusively, is never, ever signed. This was somebody doing a chore, a task. I'm good at making saddles, really? I'm good at making swords. I'm good at making paintings. But your name didn't go on it. But since the Renaissance, frankly, these people had real egos. They started to see themselves as important people. What will I accomplish? What will I leave behind? And you start seeing this spreading out during this period. How can you make a name for yourself? How can you live on in history? Well, you can make it to another part of the world, become incredibly wealthy, take over new lands, perhaps name them with yourselves. The powerful kings that were out there began to see them as not just God's servants anymore, but as somebody who could be remembered through history by land being taken over in their name that could live on. You've also got the term bourgeois, we will see a lot. It's often translated as middle class, but that's not really accurate. What it gets at is people not born into nobility, but that had a lot of money. these are the bankers, these are the wealthy merchants, these are people that are often wealthier than the nobles. Well, these people are inspired by this idea of individualism, and they've also got some cash to burn, and they start spending it on things. They start spending it on works of art. Eventually, some start saying, you know, I could invest in a technology laboratory. I could invest my money in perhaps a ship. Perhaps I could help a king fund a trip to another land, etc. And of course, the individualism, of course, it's linked with the printing press, because this is how people express themselves and how they became known to others. Taking a look at this sixth one, you know, up until this point, if we had spent more time on early Europe, the class has changed this year, as I mentioned, but every time I used the term France, I would have held up my little index and middle fingers on each hand of the quotations, because there was no such thing as France in 1200. There was no such thing as Spain. You could argue that perhaps with its island status that there was kind of an England, although not terribly unified. There certainly was no Germany, no Italy, no Russia. These were just meaningless terms. Now, people spoke Spanish languages or French-ish languages, etc. Well, you start seeing a change here. You start seeing actual nation-states, and that's what this alludes to. Notice, no quotation marks. France, England, Spain, the Netherlands. These are real countries, real nation-states. By the way, Germany and Italy, they retained their quotation marks until the 19th century. Now, what does this mean? Well, you start seeing these centralized, bigger states. Probably the one you might be familiar with is when Isabella married Ferdinand, Castile and Aragon, and more or less unified, or at least brought Spain together. Well, what does that mean? These two powerful monarchs uniting a large amount of land. Well, they're able to tax more, they have more resources, they have more money built up, and when somebody, say, a Christopher Columbus comes along and says, I need this much money for an expedition, it's possible. It's something that can be done. And in fact, there's a desire, because we start seeing the very birth of nationalism. Recall that back in the days of the Crusades, you were either Western Christian warriors, or perhaps you identified with your family, with your region that you lived in. But nobody would walk around saying, I am from France, France is better than Spain. That would make no sense at all. You start to see this, though. These powerful, powerful kings who identify themselves as French, as the Spanish. And if the Spanish have taken over some territory, well, the French need to do so as well. Also, I think kind of worth mentioning two other empires. The Habsburg Empire we'll come back to later, but that's the so-called Holy Roman Empire, and particularly the Ottomans. The Ottomans had become a powerful centralized state, and in fact had more or less with their navy taken control of the Mediterranean Sea. It was open to Europeans for sure, but they had to pay fairly high taxes. In other words, Ottoman power on the Mediterranean Sea meant that some of these European countries needed to look elsewhere. Now this one ought to be very clear. Stop for a reason. How does this explain why it was inevitable that Europe make it to the Americas by 1500? Missionaryism, absolutely. The idea of spreading the word of God. This becomes even more so with the Catholic Church following the Protestant Reformation. By the 1520s, as we will cover in the next chapter, by the 1520s, Western Europe was divided between Catholics and Protestants. And at this point, the Catholic Church, who has lost both the souls of many, many people in Europe, but also their financial resources, sees the Americas, sees the new areas as a way of recouping the numbers and the wealth, number one. But even before then, the idea was, because the Ottomans had begun to grow powerfully. They had conquered Constantinople in 1453. They were moving through southern and eastern Europe. And the idea was, Well, we need to find ways to keep our religion alive, to strengthen the Catholic Church. Let's go off into China, into India. Let's beat the Ottomans there. Of course, they found the Americas instead. But this is also a part of it. And I won't even ask you, excuse me, I won't even ask you to slow down and think that I'm getting at here, because I just couldn't find an image for it. But what I'm getting at, this is Prince Henry the Navigator, the, as it says, patron of Portuguese exploration. What I'm getting at is this, is that, well, it's called an autocatalytic process. Success leads to more people attempting to do something, which leads to more success, which leads to others doing it. If Fred succeeds, Murray gives it a try. And if Murray succeeds, Giselle wants in the action. What I'm getting at is by the 1470s, 1480s, 1490s, some sailing expeditions, particularly the Portuguese in Africa and Asia, had been very successful, very fruitful. We're beginning to bring in a lot of wealth and power. And that certainly inspires both individual people but other nation states to do the same. Again, this is the world in the 14th century. You are seeing by this point, of course, the Portuguese are now here as well, so Europe is starting to get involved by the 1450s or so. But for the most part, this is the way the ocean trading world had been for the, well, previous 800, 900, 1200, 1300 years. We're going to skip Shanghai and we'll take them at another point. So, stepping back, here's where we are by 1490. I suspect many of you, all of you, should be familiar with the date 1492. That's when Columbus first arrives in the Americas. In the year of 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So 1490 is just before that. First of all, Europe is experiencing an economic crisis. There's a population increase, there's not work for everybody, there's a land shortage, to be sure. The Renaissance, really like in its highest form right now. Now again, most people living in Europe were not directly affected by the Renaissance. Your average peasant knew nothing about Da Vinci's work, maybe had seen some of these paintings or sculptures, say on a trip to Rome on a pilgrimage, but it had made almost no impact in people's lives at all. However, that curiosity is there. That idea of individualism, that it inspires other people, and as wealth begins to grow, as production picks up a little, more and more people are living in big cities, well, this is going to be more people that are curious, interested, willing to take some risk. We had mentioned the primogeniture system. I don't think we need to go into that more, but yeah, what do we do with those landless younger kids? You see the shipbuilding development, the navigation tools, etc., the cannon mounted on ships. It was largely smaller city-states. The Genoese, the Venetians, for example, in Italy, that's Genoa and Venice in modern Italy, and the Ottomans, who we think of as being a land-based empire, but again, they had a very powerful navy and they controlled the Ottoman Sea. Some pretty big political changes, as mentioned. You know, these unified, powerful nation-states. The new monarchs, Henry VIII, who will come back to of England, this is somebody who saw themselves as not just the noble with the most power, so hooray, I get to be called king. They saw themselves as the one legitimate ruler, and they were able to use the wealth they had gotten, the organization of the military, to take real control over their societies. There was very little question at many times who the one person was ruling England or France or Spain at any given time. That's not necessarily a good or bad thing, but it certainly does lead to a concentration of wealth. You see Ferdinand and Isabella, two separate states in Spain were unified, they combined their sources. The invention of the printing press, and yep, of course, the religious motivation. So here's our world in 1440. Technically, this little tiny nib here of Brazil would not have been known. As far as they knew, you would simply continue going until you got to the east coast of Africa. Incidentally, I mentioned the ocean currents, and one of the interesting things is the Portuguese began to sail around Africa. They did not, of course, need to stick close to the coast, which created a lot of problems. They, in fact, would follow these little ocean currents and wind currents, and eventually it was called the Volta de Mar, the return of the sea. They would go far, far, far out into the South Atlantic Ocean and then make their way back through using their astrolabe, using their compass, and know exactly when they needed to turn. Not surprisingly, eventually one Portuguese captain went out a little too far and ding, 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 here we are, Brazil. And this is how the map would have looked at the world that day at that point. It's kind of interesting to take a look at it and see what's familiar and not, but you can slow down the video if you'd like to. I'd like to take a very, very quick look at the Portuguese. The Portuguese, I won't spend any time with this slide, but the Portuguese themselves. Portuguese, a couple of names worth knowing. Prince Henry the Navigator. As mentioned, he was not actually much of a sailor himself, but he was a wealthy prince and he funded a navigation school to begin with. Under his name, certainly the trips to West Africa became very lucrative. The gold, the ivory, and of course the slaves. By the way, because you have these urban cities and you have this excess wealth, this early bourgeois class, the merchants and so forth are coming up with, you start seeing modern banking in Italy, in Germany, eventually in England and the Netherlands, and in fact, you find people who are willing to loan money to individual companies or to states to finance some of these with the return of interest coming back, and that's an important part of the story. You see the name Prester John, by the way. Prester John did not exist. Prester John was a myth. Somewhere locked in the heart of Africa is a Christian kingdom run by Prester John. We must someday go and rescue him and save him from the heathens of Africa. This was one of the motivations, but again, an entirely fabricated story. Bartholomew Diaz makes it around the Cape of Good Hope. In other words, we now know how far South Africa extends. Vasco da Gama, a decade later, even more. He goes by open seas to begin with, which makes him get there much quicker, and he makes it around the Cape of Good Hope. That's Cape Town, South Africa, by the way, and makes it all the way to India after that. Here you see the major explorations, and these are, actually it's a combination. There are also some Spanish ones as well. But up here you see primarily Diaz, who makes it all the way down here to the Cape of Good Hope. You see Da Gama making all the way to India and then through to Indonesia, etc., etc. So you see these major trips at this point. The Spanish begin in the late 1490s, early 1490s with Columbus. Again, the Portuguese control little bits of land, the exception being Brazil. They don't attempt to dominate or take over. Their goal there is to trade under circumstances that they want. And this was not always friendly trade. This was often bombarding with cannon and then forcing the other people to accept their terms. They charged tolls, they forced fees, etc. And the real key, again, was that advanced weaponry. The Portuguese, as a Catholic state, become especially interested in spreading the Catholic faith as well. A couple of examples: Francis Xavier, temporarily converted many thousands in Japan, and we'll get to Matteo Ricci later, who spent a lot of time in China. Again, with fairly limited success. Christianity does spread to many parts of the world, but has never taken a really strong hold in Asia, with the exception of a couple of smaller states. And I'm not sure, I believe this is the last slide, so there will be no great farewell because there might be another after this that I've forgotten, but I believe that this is where I'm stopping. So again, you're going to see limits to the Portuguese. They had the small population, limited resources to be sure. Look, it's hard, an empire this huge, if they were to really be setting up shop all the way from China to West Africa, be awfully hard to administer. And there's a lot of opposition. The Chinese are not about to be taken over. The Mughals in India, although they apparently are a little bit weaker than they might have expected, and in fact the British eventually do take them over in the 18th century, not something the Portuguese could do. Of course, disease is a problem. Yes, it is a Eurasian disease pool. However, the stuff that is endemic in East Asia is quite a bit different from Europe, and this makes it fairly difficult as well. And the missionary work, with a couple of very small exceptions, does not take over very well. I believe this is the last slide in this, and so I will try to save this and hope to God that I haven't just wasted another half hour of my life. So again, watch this over, take some notes, come in with discussion questions, factual or otherwise, and enjoy your discussion. Take care. Bye.